There is absolutely no sign whatsoever that the Chinese are going to blink or politically can blink now that Donald Trump has kind of raised the stakes so publicly, so, performatively.
Not only does that pose the possibility of a really massively sharp US economic slowdown, a recession, it will by definition have enormous impact in the rest of the world.
Everyone is now wondering what to do in the face of these tariffs. Do you cave? Do you call up? Do you try and negotiate? Or do you put up a middle finger? And China's response is a middle finger.
It was a big mistake, this Chinese escalation, because they're playing with a pair of twos. Traditionally, if you look at the history of the trade negotiations, we are the deficit country. So what do we lose by the Chinese raising tariffs on us?
That is Scott Bessent, the US Treasury Secretary, and he's responding to China's warning that they are going to fight to the end against fresh tariffs of 50%. They are now locked in a trade war that's going to affect all of us. Who's going to blink first?
Call it a pissing contest, call it a game of chicken, call it a game of poker, with each side raising the stakes ever higher. This is China versus America, the world's two preeminent economic superpowers. There is the potential for enormous economic damage. What's going to happen next? Welcome to the News Agents. It's John.
It's Emily.
It's Lewis.
And the post last night on Truth Social from Donald Trump, where he says, right, well, screw you, China. You do this to us. We warned you. We're going to come back with even more tariffs. So that effectively, from today, unless China blinks, backs down, folds, whatever, arm wrestles and collapses, then Chinese goods are going to be subject to 104% tariffs before they can enter the United States of America. This is escalating and escalating fast. And the language of Donald Trump last night, you thought, well, does he want a solution to this? Or does he just love the idea that this is a game of poker that the whole world is watching?
Yeah, the Chinese Beijing's Commerce Ministry spokesperson said that Trump's threat is just exposing the US's blackmailing nature. If the US insists on going its own way, China will fight it to the end. And I think what this is a kind of test case for the rest of the world, but it is a test case that involves the only two economies that really matter. In other words, everyone is now wondering what to do in the face of these tariffs. Do you cave? Do you call up? Do you try and negotiate? Or do you put up a middle finger? And China's response is a middle finger. And there is a certain amount of prurience, I think. We kind of want to see which way this goes now, because at the bottom of this really is the whole question of debt and America's debt and China's currency, and whether they're basically trying to knock America's economy off the top spot. This is what Trump always accuses China of, devaluing their currency to kind of basically make themselves much more competitive. And they're locking horns now in the most visceral, visible way. And it is a blood sport.
I think this is where this story could potentially enter proper doom loop territory, because there is the possibility with the rest of the world, or the tariffs as Trump has already announced them. Yes, as we've been saying for days now, they're highly damaging. It's a massive moment in the post-war economic order. But they could be absorbed, and many of them may be negotiated away in the next weeks and months. This feels of a, potentially at least, if Trump goes ahead with it, of a different magnitude, because you have two, as you say, John, economic superpowers. China and the US together account for 47%, nearly half of the global economy. And not only that, but as we know, and in a way this is partly what this is all about, these tariff policies, as we know, for good or ill, and a bit of both, China has become the workshop of the world over the last 20 years. It is the big geopolitical economic story of our lifetime. Hard to believe that in the late 90s, the early 2000s, China still had a smaller economy than the UK. In that time, there has been an economic transformation, and not just in kind of traditional industries and manufacturing, the sort of things we might associate with it. The Chinese Industrial Revolution continues apace. In the last few years, developing into whole new advanced manufacturing markets, most notably, of course, electric cars. So if we're talking about tariffs which have the potential to double consumer prices in the US, not only does that pose the possibility of a really massively sharp US economic slowdown, a recession, a huge impact on consumers, it will by definition have enormous impact in the rest of the world, because the trade between those countries, that back and forth, those complicated supply chains, inevitably has huge knock-on repercussions. Just bear in mind, in 2024, the US imported $439 billion worth of goods from China, accounting for 13.5% of all US imports. So you double all of the prices on everything involved in that 440 billion. Just imagine the economic consequences.
And Scott Bessent there, who I think sounded very unconvincing as the Treasury Secretary, going out there to sort of argue the Trump case, disparagingly saying, well, all China are playing with is a pair of twos, as if it's a poker game against
Nonsense.
Donald Trump, who holds, a full house or a royal flush or 4 aces or whatever.
It's back to having no cards, isn't it?
Exactly. It's just ridiculous. And the other thing to point out, which I do think is relevant to this, and it's about America being a democracy and China being an autocracy. Yes, these tariffs that Trump is imposing will cause enormous economic pain to China. China has withstood economic pain in the past. And Lewis, you were talking about kind of fairly recent history about the size of the Chinese economy. I mean, you go back a few decades and, the Long March and people's kind of hunger and whatever else and starvation in China. Whereas in America, I don't think there is the readiness to take that sort of pain that Donald Trump is about to inflict on the American people if these tariffs remain at this astonishing level. Because, as Emily read out, there is absolutely no sign whatsoever that the Chinese are going to blink or politically can blink now that Donald Trump has kind of raised the stakes so publicly, so performatively.
The only problem with this is that China is not as strong as it used to be. It's already lost a lot of its manufacturing base to other Southeast Asian countries, not least because we've seen Trump sort of escalate things with China in the past, and other countries have basically picked up where China has left off. China itself is going through what feels like the start of the economic doldrums anyway. It is not the powerhouse that it was 10, 15 years ago. It is not at the cutting edge in a way that I think would have made it feel more robust in standing up to America. And so when Bessent says it's got the twos, obviously that's kind of America talking about America first and all the rest of it. But I think China is hurting at the moment. It really is hurting, and it's lost a lot of its manufacturing base already. And so what is interesting now is to see what other blocs are telling China at the moment. We just heard von der Leyen, the EU Commissioner, come out and say, can everyone back down? Can you back away from the tariff thing? I was just at a talk with the Hungarian foreign minister who said, look, we get on really well with China. We get on really well with America. We're trying to get everyone to back away. As journalists, you kind of want to see what happens next, because it's kind of, it's the big flames. But actually, if you're trying to run any kind of economy at the moment, you're bringing everyone down from the edge.
You're right, Emily, that China, in relative terms, over the last 30 years, has been going through a period of relative economic weakness. It has been growing more slowly. It's got huge demographic problems, self-imposed because of the old one-child policy, and it's got aging population, and it is having to compete with, go through that process that the West went through, where suddenly wages are rising and you have to compete with lower wage economies. But I think that is precisely why this could be such an inflection point and moment of danger, not just economic danger, but geopolitical danger. We know that China and the US for many years now have been locked in an uneasy embrace. They are, and this doesn't just concern Trump, Biden and so on. Biden was very aware of the geopolitical competition between the US and China, and much of what he did internally with the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, all of these things, are onshoring, say, semiconductor production away from Taiwan.
He kept up the tariffs that Trump imposed.
Indeed
Biden didn't get rid of them.
Indeed so. There is more continuation here than often meets in continuity than often meets the eye. So to introduce this act of profound economic aggression into a scenario and situation where the Chinese Communist Party is already pretty worried about the slowing of the Chinese economy. They know that they basically need to keep 5% a year every single year, come what may. That is their internal target. They need to get 5% GDP growth. They think if they do that, if they keep living standards rising for the enormous Chinese middle class population which now exists, then they are safe. That is the basic deal, right? You do not have democracy. You have the Chinese Communist Party with all of the exigencies that it has as long as you have wealth. They will be scared and they will be worried about the prospect, which will be really damaging to China, of these tariffs and tariffs and tariff upon tariff. And yet, as you say, John, will they back down? Well, partly no, or probably no, because they are not just an economic power. They have designs to be a geopolitical superpower. And they do not want to be seen to back down, to look cowardly, to look weak, to look feeble in the wake of American political aggression, either for internal domestic political reasons or external domestic political reasons. So, as I say, this is potential doom loop territory.
That is a kind of hideous scenario that a trade war becomes a kinetic real war. We're still a long way from that. I'm also struck by some of the stuff that is going on. Of course, we've got China and America, and as you said, Emily, it is visceral. Kind of watching these two superpowers square up to one another as, right, well, if we do that, then we'll do that, and then you do something else, and so it goes on. And that's what we've had in the last 36, 48 hours. It's below that, though. You've got, Britain now talking about, well, maybe we can get the trade deal with India that we want, because India have been slapped with 26% tariffs by America. And so India might be more acquiescent to doing a trade deal now with the UK. And so there's all sorts of scurrying around that is slightly below the headline of China USA, where there are deals being done, or hopefully, governments are looking at ways that we can bolster our trading position because of the jolt that America has given everything.
I mean, that's the other thing, is that if China stops selling to America, stops trading with America, and this basically looks like the beginning of that bust up completely, then where does China send all its manufacturing? It sends it to the EU, which means it's much harder for our domestic manufacturers to compete with that stuff. They call it dumping, essentially. And so part of the ongoing talks is to say to China, don't send your stuff over here. Don't do it. We don't want it. I think the thing you have to remember is that we're talking about governments as if it was the government doing the trading. It's not. It's individual companies. You can't actually control what individual companies do. So it's not diplomacy in the same way of is this part of NATO? Is this part of the EU? It's about individuals and their companies and people's livelihoods on a very, very sort of particular basis. So, if China finds there's a market in the EU, how do we stop that? Right.
Or if you've already made goods that are just sitting kind of in a factory,
where do they go?
Packaged, whatever, and America cancels the order, right, let's sell them to Europe cheap because
because we've got to offload them somehow.
Exactly.
And there's this isn't an economic thing, but as we've been sat here, just on the geopolitics and the potential tension between the US and China, really intriguing and interesting announcement that's come out of Kyiv. Literally in the last hours, we've been sat here saying that Zelensky is saying that Ukrainian forces have captured 2 Chinese nationals fighting in eastern Ukraine, in Donetsk. In fact, they found 6, presumably have killed 4, and captured 2. He's requested an explanation from Beijing. A lot of speculation about the possibilities of Chinese mercenaries and so on. But we know this is a conflict which has become a de facto proxy war with lots of different, we've got North Koreans there, the Iranians helping, and so on. And, obviously the West has been helping Ukraine in a sort of similar fashion. But the US, you can see how Zelensky will play this with Trump and China, particularly at this moment of tension between them, which is to say, you need to find an explanation for this. And you need to ask what on earth Chinese nationals are doing, fighting in Ukraine, particularly given the tension between the two countries.
Hasn't Donald Trump sorted out the Ukraine?
Well, indeed, John. Yeah, it's funny that, isn't
it? And the Middle East, hasn't he done? Because we've gone
and now Iran.
Yeah. I think that kind of frames it really well in terms of it's so easy to forget that a week ago, 2 weeks ago, all we could talk about was Ukraine, Russia.
Absolutely.
And he's made absolutely zero progress.
Putin's loving the tariffs war.
Yeah,
right?
Completely. Well,
takes the spotlight off.
Putin particularly.
Absolutely.
Doesn't have to worry about a thing.
Yeah.
And the gnats concentration that is Donald Trump has gone elsewhere.
But exactly, that's the tension span. But I wonder whether, are the Danes breathing more easily now that we're in a trade war because we don't have to worry about Greenland? I suspect Greenland and Canada still have cause to worry. I think Donald Trump's obsession with the Arctic is going to prove to be longer lasting. But, Zelensky just being able to use this as well as a way of weaponizing, reminding Donald Trump about, it's not just, if you want to peel Russia away from China, what the hell are Chinese nationals doing?
Arguably, it's also a very smart thing of Zelensky to do, right? We just happened to find the Chinese soldiers today. You might want to come back whilst you're having this war with China to check on what's happening in my country right now.
I think you're so right, John, about the attention span thing. And in a way, we're to blame as well, the media, right? We also have the attention span. We start to mirror him because we just echo and follow what he's doing. The truth is, it is such a good comparison with Trump versus Biden, right? As we've said a few times on the show, actually, if you take a big step back, we're 3 months in, near enough, to the Trump presidency. He makes all of these promises. Is the world substantially different from the one he inherited from Biden? Yes, in some ways, in the sense that he's made changes, economic changes to the economic order, political order, alliances, all of that sort of thing. But have any of those things actually done the things that he said he would do, which is ameliorate and indeed solve these conflicts, whether it's the Middle East, Ukraine, the economy? No. The difference is that Trump, because he looks energetic and active and commands the conversation the whole time, we sort of help him be lulled into this sense that he's in control of it, that he's commanding it, as opposed to Biden, who, yes, okay, he wasn't exerting control either, but it's just because he was quiet and silent, and therefore a narrative sort of built around him that he was not in control. But the truth is, neither are in control.
It's a made-for-TV presidency.
Yeah.
So,
but
if you talk to journalists who are putting their evening bulletins together, you have these conversations with
different.
Well, no, I was going to say, they know that they actually don't need to do anything.
Yeah.
They could wait every day until half an hour before they're on air and get whatever he's just said in the Oval Office, or whatever he's put out on Truth Social, or whatever he's just come up with in his head in the last 10 minutes. And that could be your lead story. And actually, the danger is it makes all of us, the media, incredibly lazy, because we just listen to the last thing and not the actual problem.
Look, if one of the principal goals of Donald Trump was to deliver peace to the Middle East and deliver peace to Ukraine so that he would be voted to get the next Nobel Peace Prize, I would argue that nearly 3 months in, he is not a millimetre closer to achieving that goal. Because you look at what's happened, you look at the sort of steps that have been taken, and you realise how badly thought through they were and how little they have yielded so far.
Zelensky, literally as we've been sat here, has tweeted out a video showing the Chinese soldiers that they've captured, saying that, demanding immediate response from China, and saying that Russia's involvement of China, along with other countries, whether directly or indirectly in this war in Europe, is a clear signal that Putin intends to do anything but end the war. A response from the United States, Europe, and all those around the world must be had who want peace.
We'll be back in a moment with the way the whole tariff war, the trade war, is affecting public opinion here at home and our attitude towards the United States. And to make sense of where we are and what impact the kind of turmoil and mayhem and maelstrom of the past few days, few weeks has had, we are joined in the studio by our guide and translator of all things public opinion, Luke Tryl from More in Common. Luke, good to see you again. I know you've been doing polling, and it's about polling about what we feel about America and whether they are our allies. Were you surprised by what you found?
I was really surprised, because you've got to remember that the idea of the special relationship, the idea that the US is one of our kind of closest allies, is quite well embedded into public opinion. And when we got the results back, it was actually a little bit of a jaw-dropping moment, because what we found was that today, only 43% of Brits now consider the US to be an ally. So, well under half of Brits now saying that. And we also asked about Donald Trump specifically. Is he an ally or an enemy of the UK? And interestingly, people were more likely to say he was an enemy. 30% said Donald Trump was an enemy of the UK. Just 28% said ally, and 33% said neither. Now, you compare that with other world leaders. So right at the other end of the scale, you've got Mark Carney, where you've got 70% say that he is an ally of the UK, and around 70% saying Canada is an ally. So this is a really big shift, and it's a shift which has happened basically since the Trump presidency. It dipped quite dramatically after the Ukraine crisis and the Oval Office meeting. That's when it fell to about half. But it's gone even lower.
I'm amazed that people are so engaged, politically engaged, that they know who Mark Carney is, frankly. I mean, you know, a Canadian Prime Minister who's only actually been in the job a few weeks. Yes, obviously he has the UK contact. But don't you find that surprising that people have kind of, I don't know, that they've already made those assessments?
I think there definitely is a greater awareness of kind of geopolitics than, you know, if you'd asked me 6 months ago, would I be talking to people in fairly politically disengaged groups about tariffs? I'd have said absolutely not. But you start a focus group now, and it's the first thing that people want to talk about. Again, in the same poll, we've got 2/3 of the country say tariffs are on their worry list. It's just sort of unimaginable this time last year.
Is that because they are kind of genuinely concerned about the state of the world? Or do they see it as, oh my God, this could affect my livelihood, this could affect my pension, my savings, or, you know, my job, or whatever it happens to be. If you're a car worker, you know, it's understandable.
Yeah, no, it's very much the latter. And the interesting thing, which you get in the polling, you see, you know, around half the country are worried about what it means for the cost of living. Around half say they're worried about what it means for growth. But in the focus groups, you get something else, this worry that, oh my goodness, this is going to be another one of those long line of disruptive things that we've basically had since Brexit. You talk to people and they say, we had Brexit, we had the rows about Brexit, we had the pandemic, cost of living crisis, Ukraine. You know, for lots of people, life and the world feels like this roller coaster, which is constantly going downwards, and they can't catch a break. And it really is contributing to that sort of, we've talked about before, that sort of mood of national gloom, and that sense that not just that things are bad, but kind of a hopelessness.
But that's why I think this one is really interesting. I'm just going to read through this. Half of Britons back retaliation on the tariffs. I mean, that doesn't suggest hopelessness. That suggests something that feels like, you know, we want to kick him where it hurts, right?
Yeah, well, I think it suggests a sort of, actually, you know, you've done this to us, we want to push back. Like, Brits really don't want to be seen as a pushover. And even if you say to people, but, you know, it might make things worse here, people still think we should put up a fight. In fact, in a previous poll question, we actually asked people, even if, we added the caveat, even if it makes inflation worse, is it worth us doing retaliatory tariffs? And people still said yes. Because we know that, you know, Brits really don't like this idea of us being seen as a pushover. They kind of thought we were in the Brexit negotiations, and there's a risk of that being seen to happen again.
There are other bits of the polling which are sort of slightly paradoxical, because given, exactly as you say, there is this kind of screw them, we're not going to put up with this, we need to retaliate. That has exactly not been Keir Starmer's approach. Keir Starmer's approach has been to play it very cool, to play it very long, to be conciliatory, and his poll ratings have gone up. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, he is getting credit for his handling of both Ukraine, where we know the public broadly approve of the stance he's taken. And if you ask, is he doing okay acting as that bridge? The public say yes. They also give Starmer credit for the fact that the UK has got a lower rate of tariffs. So it's 45% say Starmer is at least somewhat or entirely responsible. 36% say not very or not responsible at all. Now, that's not a huge margin, but actually, when you think about it, given his popularity is so underwater, the fact that you've got nearly 50% of the country saying this is at least in some part thanks to the PM.
A follow-up to that, because in the past few days I've read quite a lot about, look, if he's going to do this to us, then what we need to be is closer to Europe and, talk of all the reset of the relationship. And yet, I see as well in the polling that it's not we must get closer to the EU. It's the fact that we have got a lower rate because we're not part of the EU.
Yeah, I actually think it's a bit of both, if you look at it. So when we asked in the polling, is the fact that the UK has got a lower rate a benefit of Brexit? The public say yes. And interestingly, even Remainers say yes, it's a benefit of Brexit. But we also had the option, does it make it worth the cost of Brexit? So, even though this is a benefit, does it make it the whole of Brexit worth it? And then the number drops to 23%. And actually, if you do a forced choice question, should the UK be looking to Europe or the US, they're very much saying Europe now. So
Europe economically.
Economically, yeah.
So what does that mean? I mean, are people fleshing that out?
No, not really. I mean, again, so much of public opinion is, to use your phrase, John, paradoxical. What they don't want, and people are really clear about this group, is to go back to Brexit rows.
Yeah.
People just don't want us to talk about Europe again. I've often described it as sort of like, that Victorian saying about kids on Europe, that they sort of want children to be seen and not heard.
Yeah.
I think that's what the public want on Europe. Basically, they want us to get to a closer,
Just
better
don't talk about
relationship.
it.
Just not have a fight.
But not the big fights and not it dominating everything. But there is definitely more scope. And even on things, and this is what surprised me, even on things like a common European defence force. Now, that used to be the sort of big
Federalist,
bugbear of
Federalist Army.
we can't have-
I mean, support for that's doubled since 2020. So there has definitely been a shift in opinion. And the other interesting thing that came out of the polling is there is really limited appetite for the UK to make a whole series of concessions to the US. So
Interesting.
chlorinated chicken,
Yeah.
absolute no-no. Repealing the digital services tax, people more likely to oppose. Reducing oversight of social media. Freeing Tommy Robinson, we tested, because we know that Elon Musk, Trump's big ally, would like that. Against that and against concessions on Ukraine.
We found a real backbone. I mean, we found a kind of Love Actually backbone, haven't we? Where we sort of want our Prime Minister to be the one that, talks about David Beckham's left foot and David Beckham's right foot, and then socks it to the Americans because we don't like being run over.
Yeah, they want. I mean, they want Starmer to be pragmatic.
Yeah.
They don't want him to sort of blow everything up and make things worse. But they also, they don't like the idea of Britain just being the poodle that goes along with what everyone else wants. And I think the one perhaps risk for Starmer, as I say, he's coming out of these numbers pretty well. His approval rating is a little higher. The risk is the proportion of people who say he's too close to the US has jumped up 10 points in the past couple of weeks, and that's a number that I'd be keeping an eye on.
So he now has to put a little bit.
He has to now do the bit of the independence bit. It's a fine line, but he's got to do that to keep the public on side.
And is there any read across into the party political standings, given that we are, a few weeks away from local council elections?
So I think for the interesting thing is that it has basically slightly separated Starmer from some of the domestic gloom. And the way that you look at that, the way that I look at it, is tracking Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves' approval ratings. Because they basically moved in lockstep up until the Ukraine crisis. And by lockstep, I mean falling down, down, down. What happened then was Starmer's moved up a bit, but Rachel Reeves have continued to go down. So it's definitely giving Starmer a chance, I think, to reintroduce himself to voters. But the domestic picture hasn't changed.
So we can blame her for the economy, and you can praise him for
the
our standing on the
international affairs.
That's exactly what you're seeing. And I think, perhaps somewhat unfairly, I think Rachel Reeves is at risk of becoming the unpopular face of this government. I did a focus group in Peterborough just after the spring statement, and people were saying, she's pretty heartless, isn't she? And
it was pretty much the same with Osborne and Cameron, though, wasn't it? That Osborne was prepared to be the evil one.
I just wonder whether there's a degree of misogyny.
Well,
Chancellor,
I think the difference between Cameron and Osborne, though, is that people, when you talk to people, they kind of elect the Tories to do
that dirty work,
the harsh
Yes.
stuff. Whereas, and there's a guy in Merthyr Tydfil, actually, when I spoke to you afterwards, who said, with the Labour Party, that's supposed to be about the working class, and I don't know what about. And I think that's the challenge. I think it is understandable that Labour obviously always has to work harder to convince people that it can balance the books.
Yeah.
But I think just with some of the disability stuff, they've risked getting on the wrong side of that compassion versus toughness axis.
Can I just take us back, before we lose you, Luke, to the UK anti-America feeling? Does it actually, I don't know if you're doing any of this polling, do you think we're seeing less inclination to go there, to holiday there, to spend our money there? Are you seeing anything, the way that Canada's got this sort of, anti-American goods stuff going on?
I don't think so just yet. Not least because, for lots of people, a US holiday is something that you don't do that often. People certainly haven't brought it up. But I am interested in these Buy British campaigns and whether
that's
it leads to...
Ed Davies doing the whole, buy Scottish, buy UK, buy buy local.
Yeah, and in our latest opinion poll, which actually isn't out till tomorrow, but newsagents listeners can get a sneak preview. We have the Liberal Democrats on 17%, which is the highest we've recorded for them. Obviously, we're relatively newer, but 17% is quite significant for the Liberal Democrats because all throughout, the last Parliament they weren't there, so they're definitely benefiting.
You said they're benefiting. Presumably, that is because that Ed Davey has positioned himself, to be almost to the left of the Labour Party, to be more critical of Donald Trump, to be more outspoken about what the government needs to do about Trump's tariffs.
Yeah, I think that's it. He is picking up on two levels. A, he's picking up that I'm the one that's standing up to Trump, and people like a bit of that, and it raises his profile too. The hard thing for the Liberal Democrats is cut through, which is why he's on a pogo stick or whatever. But it's also, I think, more generally, we're seeing a little bit of a return to the Liberal Democrats playing the role they played, if you remember, during the Blair government, when they became that kind of outlet for left-wing discontent. I think we're seeing that. But it also means we've now basically got polling, which is Tories on 23, Labour 24, Reform 24, Liberal Democrats 17, basically in full-party politics,
which means that actually you can't call these seats anymore, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, when we're looking at councils,
a general election on polling numbers like that,
it's impossible.
It's impossible. Luke, fabulous to have you with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Luke.
Well, before we go, we said at the top of the show, first half of the show, that Trump has the attention span of a gnat and that he makes all the media do so as well. And so as to prove the point, he has indeed, once again, even since we recorded, turned his attention back to Ukraine with an announcement from the White House that Russian and US officials will hold fresh talks, this time not in Riyadh, but in Istanbul on April the 10th. That's this Thursday. That is via a Kremlin spokesman and a White House spokesman. So fresh talks between the US and Russia, not involving Europe, not involving Ukraine, about the outcome of the war, which is now more than 3 years old. We will doubtless be covering that on the show later in the week. We will be back tomorrow. See you then.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.